Hello, everybody. Today, I would like to begin live blogging my translation and reading of a book of interviews with Slavoj Zizek that was published in French in 2010. And I'll just check that. 2010. And contains some very interesting stuff that he doesn't talk about altogether in that way in his other works that are available in English. So I decided I'd just read through, translating all the time and commenting a little, and that way make the content available. It's 218 pages long. It's got 10 chapters. Not sure if this shows up. So I'll just translate the table of contents as well. First, Slavoj Zizek, Across the Réel, À travers le réel. So whatever that means, across the real. I sort of associated it with Through the Looking Glass. Normally, we're supposed to, it's à travers, there's the root travers. There it's a prepositional, in a prepositional phrase, but the verb to traverse comes up in Lacanian studies, where they're meant to traverse the phantasm. So here Zizek is traversing the real, if he even got a say in the title. It's a book of interviews with Fabian Tarby, who published a book of interviews with Badiou that has been translated into English. The title in French is in Philosophie de l'événement. So the title I haven't checked, in English may be Philosophy of the Event. Okay. Across the Real, or across the universe, like across the universe. 10 chapters. 1, the couch of the philosophers, or the philosopher's couch, if you understand that as a plural with the apostrophe after the S of philosophers. The object, Lacan, or the Lacan object in inverted commas. 3, Hegel in the mirror. 4, the Badiou effect. 5, knowledges, mythologies, and religions. 6, Deleuze or Derrida, question mark. 7, politics, decidedly. 7, no, wait a second. 6 was Deleuze or Derrida. 7, politics, decidedly. 8, the Balkans and the world. 9, the lights of the cinema. Maybe there's a sort of pan les lumières, is the lights, the illuminations. It's also the French name for the Enlightenment. So we'll see when we get there. 10, a vampire, a phantom, and a werewolf. So there is a little description on the back cover, so maybe it will be useful to translate that first before getting into the book. Slavoj Zizek is an author of a thought which cannot be summed up in any of its parts. He is an insatiable thinker of the real, who se joue, who who plays or who makes fun of, because it's Suzhou. We'll just say who plays with virtuosity, with the limits between the concrete and the abstract. So that's what we're going to see in this book, because it begins with some personal reflections on his analysis, and then there are other parts that are quite abstract and philosophical, and there's the usual sets of examples, as we saw at, with the title On the Lights of the Cinema, and the last chapter title Vampire, Phantom, and Werewolf. There's lots of examples from and discussions of pop culture. The interviews conducted by Fabian Tarby, which constitute Cross the Reel, make accessible the essential articulations of Zizek's lively and engaged theory, that are nourished in particular by the study of Lacan, of Marx, and of Hegel, for whom Zizek proposes here an original reading, also nourished by his agreements and disagreements, his friendly agreements and disagreements with Alain Badiou. But it's but equally discussed in this volume is the relation of the Balkans with the world, Deleuze, Derrida, politics, myths, and the cinema. So we saw that from the chapter headings. So we're not getting much new information on the back cover. It's it's finally a passionate or exciting exercise of thought in movement that is proposed to us by Across the Reel. Then there's a quote. I think it must be from Zizek himself, so probably inside. Well, that's our problem with communism. It's not this opportunistic topic. Is there something that one can still use today in the communist idea? The problem is exactly the opposite. What does it mean to live our contemporaneity from the point of view of the communist idea? So there we're getting a little inversion. The opportunistic question will be what placing ourselves in the contemporary framework and asking what is still useful in communism. And Zizek inverts that and says, if we look at the contemporary world from the point of the communist idea, what does that mean for our life and our attempt to live our life from the perspective of this communist idea? So that's all the paratextual information that seems relevant. Chapter 1, the couch, as in the analytic couch, the couch of the philosophers. There are 3 subsections in this first chapter of analysis or about analysis. Second section, Freud, Jung. Third section, the sense of psychoanalysis or the meaning of psychoanalysis. Probably it's playing with all the different meanings of sense. Okay, of analysis or about analysis. Fabian Tabi, my first question, Slavoj Zizek, will be personal. Uh-oh. We know all these continental philosophers don't like personal questions, not for personal reasons, but for philosophical reasons. So anyhow, Fabian Tabi is going for the hunt. What have you learnt from your own analysis? There is, of course, in this question, a deeper problem. How does one, or how to link or connect, or to relate, how to relate one's, how to relate a personal history, psychoanalytic singularity to universal elements? Zizek replies, "That's a wonderful question. Dot, dot, dot. But first, I have to say that I am not ready to relate my theoretical work to my personal experience of analysis." Okay, so he's just refusing the question straight off. It's this is the typical maneuver as well for most continental philosophers. Maybe he'll be doing it over and over again here. We'll see what he deems a worthy question or not. But you're not meant to reply when you're being the philosopher. You're not meant to reply to a question straight out, directly. You're meant to be indirect. You're meant to take a detour, and that detour usually implies deconstructing the question in one way or another. Zizek has various ways of deconstructing the question. The first one is just sort of, that's great, that's a great question, but I'm not going to answer it because I'm not ready. So I'm not ready, I'm not willing to. Is he implying that one day he will be ready? I don't know. Whatever concerns my traumatisms, my personal identity, does not concern the truth of the theory itself. The foundations of my theory, I had already thought them empirically, even before my analysis. I do not think that one can learn something about my theory by analyzing my personal traumatisms. It says traumatism, maybe you can say that in English, but maybe personal traumas would do just as well. Well, that's a pretty strong affirmation. You can't learn anything about my theory by analyzing my personal traumas. Well, maybe you could. Maybe if you were Zizek or Lacan or someone else, and you really wanted to, even though your theory says that's not exactly the right way to go about it, maybe you could. There's no method. There's no universal rule. So he's coming down with a universal rule, but in fact, his universal rules should probably be taken most of the time, because I'm not going to give a universal rule myself, should probably be taken with a grain of salt. Anyhow, he's not cooperating there. And why should a dialogue be built on cooperation? He's not cooperating. He's making the move of distinguishing empirical life from uh, theoretical life, because in fact the empirical life is sort of mishmash of um, imaginary and symbolic conditions all thrown together, and would need to be reworked by theoretical concepts to get anything theoretically useful out of them. So basically, he's saying you can't go in any direct way from the uh, empirical to the theoretical. So you can't go from your empirical life uh, or from Zizek's empirical life to an understanding of his theory, just as you can't answer a question directly either, because the question is empirically given, but you would need to construct some sort of uh, situation, context, problematic to give any sort of useful sense to the question and to any answer that you would give to the question. So for me, it's the same thing as not answering the question directly. You could say it's for empirical reasons, but or contingent reasons, but there's a rationale behind that, just as there's a rationale for not extrapolating from the empirical life of Zizek to his theoretical system. By the way, d'ailleurs, as well, this analysis was a total failure, organized as such by myself. There is, in fact, no secret here. I began analysis in a moment of despair, despair about love, a despair that was that was not far from being absolute. So it's close to absolute despair over a love situation. I was on the edge of suicide. The analysis worked very well um, for me in a totally bureaucratic manner. I remember very precisely the manner um, uh, that I had for a week of thinking of killing myself. So that was the presenting symptom. That was the first problem presented, whether he said it directly or not. It's under the secret of the analytic session. But that was the problem that made him begin an analysis. Okay, he's talking empirical. Probably he had lots of theoretical and other personal reasons for beginning an analysis, but that's the primary motive. Problem in love, absolute despair, desiring to commit suicide. And the analyst would tell me, rendezvous or whatever it is for an analyst, let's say rendezvous tomorrow at 2:00. So see you tomorrow at 2:00. I would think, yes, I'm going to kill myself, but there is a session tomorrow. So that's a sort of Kafka type thing of you're deferring the suicide. Yes, I will one day commit suicide, but not today, because tomorrow I have a meeting with my analyst, or a session. And that is what saved me, because literally, in a sense that I just call bureaucratic, no, that's what saved me, but literally in the sense that I just call bureaucratic. So it wasn't just saved in some existential way, in a really concrete, physical, empirical way. That's how we got through the day to the next session, telling himself, I've got an appointment, and I won't kill myself today because I've got that appointment. So that's really concrete and physical, and it's a fragment of his empirical life. So we can say, are there other material processes going on behind the scenes? It's real, it's empirical, according to Zizek. So that's the image he had of the analytic process as applied to him, not in the next 24 hours because I've got an appointment. So I suppose that's the imaginary. It's bureaucratic because there are the symbolic considerations that I've got an appointment with my analysis. I will not self-destruct until then. So there's sort of robotic, bureaucratic respect of the symbolic contract. And what is left in silence is maybe we could say the real of the material processes, other than this quiet, I mean, I'm saying it's symbolic, it's imaginary, but it's real as well. This quite real motivation, but surely there's far more at work, as we'll see. After a month and a half, 2 months, after I gave up on the idea of killing myself, so the symptom was cured. My only goal in the analysis was to make nothing move, to prevent all subjective change. I opposed to the analysis an absolute resistance. So I've got the word absolute again. So he was in absolute despair. He was cured of that by the analysis. It was no longer absolute despair. But he put up absolute resistance. Somewhere else in an interview in English, Zizek says, because he did his analysis with Jacques-Alain Miller, Miller told him, analysis works whether you cooperate or not. So he's putting up an absolute resistance, but in fact, that's a second symptom. That's in the form of the Annunciation is perhaps more important to his analytic process than the content. He admits the enunciated content was not necessarily even true, was lots of irrelevant details, so was full of crap, but to sort of like a smokescreen. But what is not a smokescreen is the effect that he's setting up by his absolute resistance. And I put up an absolute resistance, and I think, unfortunately, that I succeeded. I invented symptoms, etc., but that's something that all patients do. That's a universal claim. That seems to concern empirical facts. Do all patients invent symptoms? I would say not necessarily, unless we come back to the idea that, of Lacan, that the man who thinks he's a king, the psychotic, is psychotic. The ordinary citizen who thinks they're a king is psychotic, and nonetheless, the king who thinks he's a king is equally crazy. So one could maintain that even if your symptom is a real symptom, it's invented at the same time. So why not go retroactively backwards and say that his primary symptom of the absolute despair in love was a true symptom, true enough, real enough to make him consider suicide very seriously, but it's a symptom that was invented precisely to get him into analysis, probably against, in some sense, his own desire. So I invented symptoms, etc., but all patients do that. But my whole economy, we could suppose that he's talking about for once, about his own libidinal economy. But my whole economy was to speak all the time. And even today, I speak too much. Why? Because my own part, or my own role in the analysis was to speak all the time, to prevent the analyst from asking me a true question, a veritable question, which could change something. I was active at each instant to prevent change, to prevent any change. That worked 1 year, 2 years, and then I left. So he's going on just a little later to say that despite doing all that, the analysis worked. It's interesting to see, is this his only analysis? Because it seems to have only lasted 2 years. Maybe it was every day, maybe 1 year of analysis with Jacques-Alain Miller equals 5 years of analysis with somebody else. But that seems to be not very long for analysis. A few months to cure, but after you're not meant to be curing symptoms as such. You're meant to be doing a far more extensive psychic revamping in analysis. So he was talking so as not to get the questions that could induce real change, according to him. So that's a massive investment in empty speech to avoid the silences, the gaps, the interventions that could turn from empty speech more towards full speech. Fabian Tabi replies, in my experience of analysis, or my experience of analysis was just one session. The analyst told me at the end, responding to my the demand that was more theoretical than existential, that I would never know what my, in quotation marks, what my unconscious was. I took a long time to understand the Lacanian savor of this little experience, or it's the same word in French, experience or experiment. So this, maybe we can say here experiment, because he is experimenting. It was an experiment. He wasn't really trying to have an analysis. Fabian Tabi. So it took me a while to understand the Lacanian savor to this little experience, and to understand that for Lacan, there is precisely nothing to understand about oneself. There's a little hyphen pause there. There's nothing to understand about oneself. Isn't that acceding to or accessing the doctrine of the empty subject? So Fabian Tabi begins with the empirical question: what did you learn from analysis? Then Zizek says, well, I killed myself in my total amorous despair, and of my desire to suicide, but that's not the point. What did I learn is not the point. And so Tabi goes now to the highest level. He says, yeah, I tried an analysis, and the analyst at the end told me that I was never going to understand or know what my unconscious is. And I was a little frustrated at first, and I thought, well, that's the empty subject. So he's sort of agreeing with Zizek. Yeah, I didn't learn anything either. But in fact, dialectical reversal, by the very fact of not understanding, I understood that it was the empty subject. So Zizek replies, I'm sorry, how long have I been talking? I can't see. Over half an hour. So this is just the first session. I'll see what I come up with. If I go on like this, it's 218 pages. It will take me more than a year to get through them. So I'll try and cut down on my own commentary and give more of the translation of the book, because that's the interesting thing, isn't it? And I'll see if anybody makes any comments. I'll try and adapt my method to various influences, including comments. So anyhow, Fabian Tabi says, "Yeah, I didn't understand anything, but isn't that the empty subject?" And Zizek replies, "I see, but to insist straight away on the doctrine of the empty subject is to act as if this was substantial. Dot dot dot. So he's saying, in fact, and this comes back with the empirical, anti-concretistic stance that he's had up to now, that theoretical concepts, highly abstract ones like the empty subject, are not to be treated as sort of dogmatic reference points. So you're substantializing. You're not meant, if you're trying to adopt the perspective of he talks on the back of the book about the perspective of the communist idea. Here we could say, from the point of view of the Lacanian idea, you're not meant to substantialize the concepts. Zizek goes on, because there is nevertheless something to understand here. He's bringing it back to himself, of my strategy in analysis. So his strategy was, we saw before, his strategy was talking all the time to avoid change. Now he's going to generalize. He's bringing it back to himself to bring out something more general. So there is something to understand in my strategy in analysis, which is to say, being active all the time so that nothing changes. It was this was for me a model or a formative experience for developing a critique of our ideological situation. I said that in my analysis, I was speaking all the time so that nothing would change. But what I noticed, or what I perceived, was that nothing would change if I was active all the time. So it's not speaking all the time in analysis is just one example of a more general symptom in his life and in the modern world. Being active all the time means preventing change. So that's what he perceived in analysis. So supposedly, according to the explicit statements, he didn't learn anything in analysis, and now he's going on to a big insight that he got from analysis, seeing that if you're active all the time, you can't change. That activity, hyperactivity, as we see in our society, this encouragement to not just to express oneself all the time, but to be active all the time, is a sure way of avoiding change. So that's what he perceived. While at the moment when I would stop, in my own case in analysis, in my case, stop talking. So at the moment when I would stop, radical rupture would take place. So what is there then? What's so new then, according to me? This is how I understand one of the aspects of subtraction. So he's referring to Badiou's notion of subtraction, but also to his own Zizek's idea of subtraction, which subtraction, soustraction in French, which has much in common with Badiou's, but which is slightly different. Precisely because the system, whether it be individual, psychic, or even political or ideological, the system can only reproduce itself across this false permanent activity. So the moment you're being frenetically talking or doing things, you're reproducing the system. You're avoiding change. You're preventing rupture. And thus, this is how I read the category of subtraction in Badiou's work. If we discount a few differences in interpretation. Subtraction is, for me, like the politics of the character of Melville's character Bartleby. So subtraction is summarized up in the "I would prefer not to" of Bartleby. We withdraw ourselves from this false activity and even from false critical activity. That's, for me, the Cartesian moment of the void, accomplished by Lacan. The beginning of all change, the first step, consists in putting an end to this false activity. So we could say, well, how is he disagreeing with uh, uh, Fabian Tabi, if he is at all? Tabi says, I understood my analyst's remark only later on, as an intervention, in fact, that brought to the fore the notion of the empty subject. And Zizek sort of agrees at the beginning of his answer, but says or gives a warning. We have to avoid substantializing the empty subjects or turning it into a dogma. But he ends with the cessation of hyperactivity as a case of subtraction, and as the Bartleby strategy, and as leading to the moment of the Cartesian moment of the void, when we put an end to all false activity. So his critique of Tabi, or his disagreement of Tabi, if there is one, is saying you can't do an analysis as an experiment because nothing is going to happen. You're turning it into an activity if you do it like that. In a certain sense, if Tabi had continued saying, I will continue my experiment 1 year, 2 years, it would have been like Zizek continuing his analysis after the cure of his depression and actively trying to oppose or resist it. If Tabi had continued, it would have been resistance by the very fact that it was an experiment. And as such, it would have been nonetheless a real analysis because his mindset of experimentation would have been the symptom that was being worked through. So that's the first section. I gave a lot of commentary. I would like to finish. This is the shortest chapter. So it's only 16 pages. The others chapters are more like 25 pages. So I'll continue. I'll try and give less commentary. It will be difficult for me not to comment because the second section is called Freud Jung. And I'm just going to throw it out there that I disagree with everything that anyone says about the relation between Freud and Jung, Lacan and Jung. They're substantializing their own positions, whether it's for Jung and against Freud or for Freud and against Jung, and they're picking and choosing within the huge corpus of each of these psychoanalytic thinkers what confirms or validates their own point of view. And I don't think Zizek is any exception. And I would say that whatever Zizek says about Jung, it's one, to confirm his own prejudices, and two, but that's okay. And two, why is it okay? We can take it, whatever he says about Jung, as a clarification of what Zizek thinks is a necessary way of thinking about analysis and of using analytic concepts. So I would take it more as revelatory of his own ideas and of not much value at all in clarifying the difference between Freud and Jung, or in expliciting, explicating what's going on in Jung. So that's my firmly held perspective for beginning this chapter, this subsection. So Fabian Tabi says, do you mean that we cannot separate the understanding of the empty subject from that which occults it or hides it, or from this false activity? Yes, I think that's what Zizek does mean. We'll see. But isn't that also, or this is also, the question of the relation between Freud and Lacan? Certain see Freud in that way. Certain see Freud as someone who by the content of his analyses, privileges again, or still privileges the idea of the structural activity of the unconscious as against the understanding of the Lacanian empty subject. Tavi is really attached to this idea of the empty subject. So maybe Zizek was right, whether you're saying you're substantializing it, uh, you're bringing it up. You're saying Fabian Tabi, you're bringing up the empty subject without having constructed any context for bringing it up. You're really attached to this concept. So it's nice to be enthusiastic about concepts. Um, uh, Zizek is quite happy to go on talking with Tabi, and he continues for uh, 220 pages almost. So there's nothing wrong with being enthusiastic about uh, a concept or a set of concepts or a thinker, but you should keep in mind that that it's probably better not to substantialize them. Anyhow, this is Tavi's idea: the relation between the false activity and the empty subject is something like the relation between Freud, who will be on the side of false activity, and Lacan, who will be on the side of the empty subject. This is a good question. Um, with Freud, one can, this is a hard word, se battre. It means to play around, to muck around, but also to struggle or fight, um, usually in a mock way. So one can play around for a certain time or interminably with all the arcane secrets of the family uh, romance, etc. Even if the question of uh, what do you call it in English? Analysis, terminable or interminable. Surely there's a better expression in English. Anyhow, um, even if the question of uh, terminable or interminable analysis in Freud and the ambiguity of Eros and of Thanatos are already in those elements in his thought, the royal roads which lead to Lacan. Okay, that sounded like a good question. What does Zizek say? I don't agree. We must not make Freud into a Jungian. So this idea of false activity uh, in Freud, because he doesn't get to the root concept of the empty subject, is insufficient, according to Zizek. So I disagree. We mustn't turn Freud into a Jungian. Jungian is a swear word there. The sense of Freudism is that of an openness to contingents and to the contingents and to the radical singularity of the phenomena of the unconscious. There is not in Freud, or there are no, in Freud, there are no keys to the unconscious, contrary to what certain think superficially, certain people think superficially. It is always ridiculous to say that Freud maintains that a cigar is a phallic symbol and other stupidities or idiocies of this type. The signification of a situation is always, for him, singularly contextualized. So it's once again the same move. Don't be too empirical in the way you think, and extrapolate the empirical unchanged into the theoretical. You've got to contextualize uh, the the empirical, and so you're already uh, doing theory, using theory when you present empirical or so-called empirical facts. Um, Either unconsciously, you just think you're talking about the facts, or hopefully in a more self-conscious, more reflective, more aware way, you know that the facts that you're the empirical facts that you're presenting um, uh, comport or contain theoretical elements that may need to be corrected. So you may need to change the facts in some way, actively. So you can't just say that about Freud, that he's just in empirical, uh, 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 concrete things to do with the family romance, and he's not uh, getting to the empty subject. So Zizek continues. Let me give an example so as to better understand how uh, Freud's approach has nothing to do with Jung's. In the, in the interpretation of dreams by Freud, a patient says that she dreamed of a funeral. The atmosphere of the dream uh, is very sad, obscure. Freud uh, doesn't interpret the dream in a hermeneutical manner. So he's not just saying this means that, which would be still too empirical. You just empirically take the dream as is, at its face value, as recounted by the patient, and then you go to work. This means that, this means that. So Freud was not hermeneutical. Continuing. He doesn't search for, in the atmosphere, as presented, the displacement of an affect. The key, so we're not, he says that there's no keys, but anyhow, the key is that this woman refound, so met again after a long time at this funeral, her old love, a woman that she had always loved, and she rejoiced at meeting up with him again. So, according to Zizek, that's the key. Well, continuing with the key. So it's not a key to the unconscious, because he talks about that before. There will be an absolute key that you could put into a dictionary. He is a quite contingent, uh, uh, contextual key. So she met up with this lost love. She had been married, never saw him again. the affect of sadness of the dream is there only to occult the fact that she had found it wonderful to meet up with again her true love. No hermeneutics of the form. An example of the hermeneutic question is he gives is, what does this sad atmosphere mean? So no hermeneutics of the form. In an aside, what does this sad atmosphere mean? Could show that the key was her joy at meeting her lost love. The signification of the dream is in this detail. My old love was present. And he continues, that's it. That's a radically non-Jungian reading. The Jungian approach would consist in asking, what is the signification of the archetype funeral in its relation to death, etc.? A totally different approach. The Jungian approach, is a spiritual Gnostic thought, which is a completely different world to that of Freud. Well, we know what he thinks Freud does, and I suppose he thinks Lacan would do the same thing, and what he would do as a theorist discussing that. What he thinks Jung will do is just silly. Jung's all to do with archetypes. He would have analyzed the archetype of funerals. He would have missed the idea that the sadness is occulting or hiding the joy. Well, if Jung had missed that, or a Jungian analyst had missed that, it would be a pretty bad analyst. So this is not at all plausible. The idea that Jung is dealing with archetypes, not just talking about archetypes in his book, which is the early Jung, well, the second early Jung after breaking off with Freud. So the idea that Jung would do that in an analysis is just false. So secondly, she meets the guy that she always loved at a funeral, and she's happy, and she dreams about a sad funeral, and so the sadness is hiding the joy. That's a pretty mechanical way of interpreting a dream, and there's no reason to think that both are not true. There's the joy of meeting the lost love, and the sadness of what could have been, and of seeing that I don't know what happened. What happened next? Let's imagine that it was just one meeting, and they never saw each other again. The sadness of life paths diverging. He could always say that the dream is too one-sided, so it's occulting something. But the joy is quite conscious, and maybe the joy was occulting the underlying sadness of a wasted life or a frustrated life. Um, uh, in fact, the way Zizek is discussing uh, the case or the example of this dream is not very contextually rich, and seems a rather superficial treatment in itself, and totally phantasmatic understanding of what um, uh, Jung would have said. Um, and basically, I think you have to compare the interpretation of dreams to Jung's own experience as recounted in the Red Book, where he doesn't mention archetypes at all. Um, the interpretation of dreams is a fragment of or a pretty big piece of Freud's autoanalysis. So there are dreams from other people. But there are lots of his own dreams. So the comparable text would be the Red Book, which is Jung's autoanalysis, and uh, how are you going to interpret non-hermeneutically both of them at the same time? So I personally am not convinced by this discussion. Fabien Tarby, okay, he's French. He's been brought up on Lacan. All those Parisian French intellectuals, they were brought up on Lacan. So obviously, he's not going to uh, find anything good in Jung, and he's going to agree uh, with uh, Zizek there. There is a mysticism in Jung's approach. He is the master of the imaginary, but of an imaginary which believes itself to be real. So, rubbish, brainwashing talking. Zizek replies, an obvious mysticism. He has always, that is to say, Jung, has always loved to flirt with alchemy and metempsychosis. Not even and, with alchemy, metempsychosis, as if they're on the same plane. So Jung didn't believe in metempsychosis or transmigration. We can kick that out. He's always loved to flirt with alchemy. That's an objection. So sorry, I'm for people who like Zizek. I'm translating Zizek, but I'm just commenting. Don't substantialize Zizek. Jung, this would take too long. This is a side question. Jung used alchemy as later, much later on in his theoretical evolution, as a series of concepts to express and push forward his psychological insults. That's a slip. His psychological insights, the way Lacan used structural linguistics to express and push forward his psychoanalytical insights at a certain stage of his theoretical evolution. So just saying, he's mystical. He always loved to flirt with alchemy and metempsychosis. Um, uh, he's violating his own principle of singular contextualization, and doesn't mean anything. Tabi, of course, loves this. He's the poet of psychoanalysis. in the sense that you are distrustful. You distrust poets. Um, you distrust the relation between a certain lyricism and the myths of purity. Well, there he's gone off on a totally different track. Fabian Tabi, who was really uh, hot on the trail of the empty subject, goes and talks about lyricism and myths of purity in Jung. So Jung's ultimate concept is the empty subject. He has a different way of talking about it, and I'm saying you have to believe me, but it's the empty subject. It's not the archetypes; it's the empty subject, but his own version of that. So Tabi missed a good occasion to get back on track with the empty subject. Anyhow, so Jung is the poet of psychoanalysis. Absolutely, says Zizek. Jung, uh, besides, Jung accepted in 1934 to become the president of the German Society of Psychology in the manner of Heidegger. This is an analyzed thing that's often used to denigrate Jung. It's true that he resigned very quickly from this presidents, but all the same, he was immediately seduced by that. Okay, so this is the myth that Jung was a Nazi. So that's okay then. That's highbrow intellectual discussion. We were all into getting away from empiricism, avoiding hermeneutics, getting to the empty subject, avoiding empty talk, and now we're just saying, anyhow, he was a Nazi. It is important to see that if Jung, in our universe of intellectuals, is marginalized, this is Zizek talking, he is at the same time extremely popular. One says, or it is said, one says that in Russia, Freud is finally being published. This is in 2010. But that's only 2,000 copies. Jung in Russia is selling for between 500,000 and 1,000,000 copies. So this is the argument from sales in Russia. This is even worse than the argument from Jung was a Nazi. Freud only sold 2,000 copies in Russia of whatever, he doesn't say. So that's a proof of the high value of Freud's concepts. And Jung sold a real lot. So Zizek should really be worried about his own popularity. Well, we all know that he probably is worried about his own popularity because other people who are reading his books, substantifying Zizek and Zizek's concepts, or are they getting to the emptiness, the real empty subject, Cartesian emptiness under it? So, sorry about that. This section is interesting from the point of view of Zizek suddenly not practicing his own method and just in indulging in binary friend enemy maneuvers. Darby replies to this argument about how much Jung has been selling in Russia compared to Freud. That's the privilege of the imaginary. It is easier to hear uh, contes savants, erudite tales, erudite fairy tales, than to endure what psychoanalysis can deliver us concerning the real. Okay, this is coming from a guy who did strictly just 1 hour of psychoanalysis. And now he's going on about being able to endure the lessons of the real as opposed to the imaginary lessons of the erudite fairy tales. Zizek replies, absolutely. And that's why it is important to trace a line of demarcation. So what interests me is the line of demarcation, whether he thinks Jung is on one side and Freud on the other, or whatever, is not my problem. The conceptual content is the line of demarcation. The problem, so it's important to trace a line of demarcation. The problem of psychoanalysis is this temptation, either the neo-spiritualist thought of Jung, or um, positivism, the purely scientific. So they're the two temptations to avoid: spiritualism or positivism. On the one hand, there is the triumph of new pharmacopoeias of chemistry, so new drugs, new new medicines. On the other hand, there is the mysticism of Jung. I'm not saying that Jung isn't mystical in some sense, but then even Lacan is willing to quote Zen and other types of mystics, and she doesn't substantialize them. And I don't think Jung substantializes the mystics that he quotes either. They're both psychoanalytical in their approach to everything. In the two cases, positivism with drugs, or perhaps now even worse, the drugs. See Hegel in The Wired Brain for even worse. So positivism with its drugs, or mystical neo-spiritualism or New Age stuff. In both cases, psychoanalysis is lost. But as I already said in the introductory chapter to the parallax, what's it called in English? The parallax view or parallax. We have more than ever need of psychoanalysis, or we need psychoanalysis more than ever. When one says that the analyses of Freud were only valid in the frame of Victorian society, one is mistaken. The paradox which always tormented Freud was not, I am, in quotation marks, I am impotent because the father, with the capital F, posed prohibition, so I must get rid of or free myself from this prohibition, End of quote. It, that is the paradox that tormented Freud, is on the contrary, quote, why am I impotent at the moment when one tells me you must do it? End of quote. Prohibition on enjoying. I'll stick to the translation of jouir, to enjoy, jouissance, enjoyment. A prohibition on enjoying can make me impotent, but an injunction to enjoy can make me even more impotent. This is the paradox of our society. We are in a hedonist society, but we have more than ever impotence and anxieties. The Freudian moment is the Freudian moment is completely contemporary. It is now that Freud is the most contemporary by or because of the paradoxes of our contemporary hedonism. So this is good. He's dropped talking about Jung and saying silly stuff about Jung, and he's back to one of his major themes. And I think that Freud himself is Hegelian. There are very profound differences between him and his two enemies. The deviation on the left and that of the right. Against Freud, if one wants to speak like an old Stalinist. On the one hand, there's Jungism. It's not only the question of knowing if the libido is sexual or not. At a more fundamental level, one discerns that Jung has remained at the level of a pre-modern symbolism. If, for example, one affirms that my symptom signifies something, that means for Jung that spiritual tendency directs, rules the symptom. Okay, he's using the adjective spiritual, and we get that that means something bad. In the adjective spiritual, there's spirit, and the relation of the spirit to the empty subject is quite close. So for me, it's an open question whether we can classify Jung as spiritual in the sense, the New Agey sense that Zizek is applying with a hammer here. Whereas Freud affirms that the symptom is an occasion of the expression of the unconscious. The unconscious is not a spiritual force, not even a force. Okay, that's his line of demarcation. Something happens corporeally, bodily, for example. That's the symptom. The unconscious, in a totally contingent manner, is of the order of a parasite. This grips onto that. That's all. So that's the unconscious of him. This grips onto that, holds onto that. So that's why there's no universal dictionary of symbols. Contingent thing holds onto another contingent singularity. So that's when everything is all pulverized down to the ultimate level of analysis. So the opposite of spiritual dictionaries. But the other enemy is the classical diagnosis, what Hegel called abstract universality. It's always a question only of identifying, of defining. One defines, for example, the obsessional neurosis by a series of traits or characteristics. One says then, we know that, or we know about that. This is what it is. It's an obsessional neurosis. That's all. Full stop. But in Freud's approach, in Freud's authentic approach, to recognize someone as an obsessional neurosis, as an obsessional neurotic, is never only to identify the characteristics which subject them to the universal definition of obsessional neurosis. No, it's literally to reinvent the universal from a concrete analysis, which is much more difficult to do. And we must do the same thing today, for example, at the social level. So you can't just take the theory and apply it and say that's recognition and representation. We've got the theory, we apply it, we know what that is, we know what it means. You have to, but you can't just stay in the empirical details. This is just this and nothing else. So you need to reinvent the universal constantly on the basis of a concrete analysis. This is very strange. Well, this is good. This is the right side of the line of demarcation. But it's very strange compared to the beginning where Zizek said first that you can't learn anything from the concrete case of his own analysis, and then went on to contradict himself and say you could learn something that constant activity, whether verbal or practical, and one could even say in thought or theoretical, is a barrier, an obstacle to change. So there was something universal learned from something concrete. But it was Zizek's reinvention of the universal in that context. So how long have I been going? An hour and a half. This is enormous, but I'll keep going. The sense or the meaning of psychoanalysis. That's the third and last section in this first chapter. I wonder, this is Fabian Tabi asking a question. I wonder if the problem of the place of psychoanalysis in society does not come from the a difference between the philosophical effects that one can draw from it, as you do, and its clinical usage, which does not seem to give the the same sort of evident or obvious effects as the pharmacopoeia. So I try and say that a bit better. There's a problem of the place of psychoanalysis in society, and Fabian Tabi wonders whether this problematic status of psychoanalysis may be linked to the difference between the philosophical effects that one can induce from psychoanalysis, and as Zizek exemplifies, and so everybody can recognize that, and the not so easy to discern effects that psychoanalysis has as compared to drug treatment. So psychoanalysis may not be as widespread as it should be because it's not producing the sort of easy fixes or rapid cures or even long-term cures that a good drug treatment seems to produce. There is this mistaken idea that one could dissolve, as far as the subject is concerned, and there's this mistaken idea that one can dissolve everything in relation to the subject rapidly in scientific and chemical knowledge. So psychoanalysis gives us some great speculative theories, but when you've got a real problem, you go for the drugs or for other scientific treatments. So scientific is clinically unreliable. The problem, no, Zizek replies, the problem is that psychoanalysis can only function in certain social conditions. I am afraid that the new societies which are developing, this combination between confidence in biotherapy, pharmacy, science, and new spiritualism, tends to banish the space of psychoanalysis. It's a bad sign. One could well end up paying the price. Jacques-Alain Miller asked somewhere if it is possible to do psychoanalysis if the social and cultural conditions are present for that. So, is it still possible to do psychoanalysis? Answering this question is the standard of the very standard of the degree of emancipation of a society. Fabian Tabi asks. So the devil can have, as is the custom, his advocate. One could refer back to the theses of Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus. Certainly, one could accuse them of reducing Freud to very little. But the question is nonetheless posed. Can there not be in psychoanalytical theory and practice, in its primary core, an inadequate hierarchical residue, even if one must recognize that their own solution, their idea of a schizoanalysis connected directly to the concrete, is pretty much as inconsistent as the first psychotherapy you run into. So that's what I call a leading question. But it's going to lead to a very interesting development. Zizek replies, but what I have tried to do is to make a compromise, a pact between Deleuzians and Lacanians, against the Deleuzians and the Lacanians themselves. Okay, this is the famous, that I think he talks about it later on, advocacy that I haven't seen him advocate elsewhere explicitly, of Deleuze-Lacan pact. Of course, if one reduces Lacan to Oedipus, to prohibition, this pact cannot be done, cannot be made. Or what do you do with the pact? Cannot be concluded. But if one envisions the Lacan of the theory of the real, who is much more interesting, ties are established with Deleuze. Deleuze is one of the greats, so one of the great philosophers. And I think that's a really good line of thought. Deleuze and Guattari say that what they're criticizing in Anti-Oedipus, they say what they're criticizing is the Lacan, or the Lacanism that's limited to the imaginary and the symbolic, and they're trying, so they say, to underline and espouse the importance of the Lacan of the real. So that's what they were saying, and Zizek is espousing that idea as well, that there's a convergence between Deleuze and Guattari. If you forget their critique of psychoanalysis, you don't forget it, but you take it as not applying to Lacan, but to misunderstandings of Lacan, you can find a convergence or a pact. It's not an identity, but it's a pact. It's a parallax as well, by the way. Badiou is right when he says that Deleuze is our only true interlocutor or dialogical partner. not Foucault, not Derrida, and not Roland Barthes. It's a shame that one envisions, one too often envisions, in the Anglo-Saxon world, um, based on the line of Negri, I think the l'envisage must be Deleuze. It is a shame that one envisions him, Deleuze, too often in the Anglo-Saxon world on the basis of Negri's line or of political appropriation. But this is my relation to Deleuze, even if it's a little popular in inverted commas. I love the scream of Edvard Munch, um, uh, like certain paintings of Bacon. This purely formal distortion, which is the real. Okay, so we know that Zizek likes logic of sense, for example. He's going on to like Deleuze's book on Francis Bacon, Logic of Sensation. When one asks me what the mask and the compulsion, the repetition compulsion means, I propose a film, a totally stupid film that I've seen 4 times with my son, The Mask. An ordinary guy, impotent, finds a mask, and when he puts on this mask, he becomes all powerful because perfectly plastic. In the middle of the film, the guy, Jim Carrey, um, uh, remarks that it's horrible that he can do everything that he wants, or make everything that he wants of his body, that he is, in fact, a slave. By this all powerfulness, this omnipotence of the mask, he becomes the slave of a total compulsion. The real is not behind the mask, it is this mask itself. So he's offering that up as a convergence with Deleuze. The mask is the real. Fabian Tabi asks, you mean that there is, despite uh, the accusations of Deleuze, a relation to think between the real of Lacan, the multiplicity of Deleuze, and then compulsion? Zizek replies, yes, that's it. That's an intervention because he's just replying sharp, brief, concise. Yes, that's it. Fabian Tabi continues, but how can we relate, finally, the most theoretical aspect of psychoanalysis with its correct practice? Okay, there he loses it. There's something really powerful said by Zizek on his relation to Deleuze and the relation between Deleuze and Lacan from the perspective of the real. And there will be a chapter later, much later, chapter 6, but it's a short one where Zizek comes back to talking about Deleuze and Derrida as well, but talking about Deleuze. But this is something that would really have deserved to be developed. So How can we relate the most theoretical aspect of psychoanalysis with its correct practice? So we're still coming back to this relation between uh, the theoretical and the empirical. Zizek replies, I know that many clinicians um, reproach us for our approach. What we do would be supposedly just nothing. We would be only doing literary speculation. But two things. First, I think that Lacan was right to insist on the fact that the members of his school could uh, well be neither analysts nor analyzed. Um, Freud, so neither analysts nor patients, you could still be members of his school. Freud said something very simple and truly profound when he said that psychoanalysis uh, would be truly possible only in a society which no longer had any need of psychoanalysts. Psychoanalytic theory is never only the theory of the practice of psychoanalysis, for there is always a dialectical tension between psychoanalytical, no, there's always a dialectical tension by which psychoanalytic theory is always at the same time the theory of the failure of the practice. Psychoanalytical theory does not describe only the conditions of possibility, but also the conditions of impossibility of psychoanalysis. It is furthermore crucial to understand that the treatment of cultural questions by Freud is not only a simple application of psychoanalysis, an extension, a more or less legitimate, a more or less illegitimate extension of it. Let's go back to the context for this mispronounced translation. It is furthermore crucial to understand that the treatment of cultural questions by Freud is not just a simple application of psychoanalysis, uh, that is to say, not just a more or less illegitimate extension of psychoanalysis. Not at all. That um, that that is to say, that sort of cultural analysis is part of the very identity of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is not only the couch, psychoanalysis is a thought. I have tried in this sense to understand the relation between hysteria and identification. It is clear that what Lacan calls symbolic identification or imaginary identification, but above all symbolic, is or resembles or is like the mechanisms that Althusser describes as interpolation. One identifies oneself with a certain position in the ideological order. Well, I find it very interesting to understand hysteria as the elementary resistance to the predominant ideological identification. As Lacan said, the hysterics question is, what am I as an object? Why am I this that you say that I am? If the official discourse says you are a woman, I am your husband, I am your master, the hysterics discourse is, but why would I be that? This idea of hysteria as resistance to identification, maybe we can see that in relation to uh, Zizek's resistance to psychoanalysis. If you've got an idea, a substantified idea of what psychoanalysis is, maybe that constellates hysterical resistance to that identity of being the patient, of the analyst, and part of all the antics that was that were the procedures and practices that Zizek came up with during his analysis. They're all part of being hystericized by the analysis and disidentifying. So maybe we're getting a rationale that not exactly justifies, but that situates Zizek's own behavior during analysis. Zizek continues, in this sense, I think that there is something to the wordplay, to the pun, hysteria, history in English. Hysteria is historic. For when there is a transformation in the predominant mode of symbolic identification, the hysterical form changes equally. 20 years ago, when there was this this type of fashion for the borderline, where one saw something, one saw in it something new. Jacques-Alain Miller said that the borderline was the contemporary figure of hysteria. In post-1968 society, this more liberal society where there is no longer any master, only experts, borderline is the new figure of hysteria. It's in this way that it is legitimate to analyze social phenomena on the basis of the psychoanalytic apparatus, because the problem is always very simple. What are the phenomena to analyze? So we're getting the rationale for Zizek being able to explain that his use of psychoanalysis as a political and social and cultural speculative theory is part of the very whatever essence, if you want, the very structuring features of psychoanalysis. One can say this in Foucault's terms. At the elementary level, the first gesture of power or active power of the analyst will be to say what deserves to be analyzed and what doesn't. Now we get this in for they know not what they do about the analyzable Slovene, which would be the case in Freud of a line of demarcation that's an active power that may or may not be legitimate. Here we're looking at the redrawing of the demarcations based on both the evolution of social conditions and also of the evolution of the position that the psychoanalyst is called onto or chooses to occupy. On this question, that is the psychoanalyst's power to decide what deserves to be analyzed or not. Jacques-Alain Miller recounted 20 years ago a very beautiful story. At the beginning of the 1940s in the United States, most of the analysts were German immigrants and were rather conservative from the moral point of view. For them, to be faithful to one's husband or wife was normal. There was no need to analyze that. On the other hand, infidelity had to be analyzed. But it's the opposite in Argentina, for example. What is thus the Freudian answer to that? The only answer is everything is to be analyzed. So there are lines of demarcation that have to be drawn. And Zizek was trying to draw a line of demarcation between real psychoanalysis and spiritualism and positivism, for example. But this analytic active power on deciding what is to be analyzed and what is not to be analyzed is something that Zizek rejects. He claims that everything is to be analyzed. That brings to mind the famous sentence that Freud said when asked about his cigar smoking. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So he's saying this is not to be analyzed. These cases of a thing is just a thing are not to be analyzed. Zizek's answer is everything is to be analyzed. So this idea of the authoritarian gesture of the conservative or reactionary type of analysis, or just the power move of analysts. This brings to mind, I'm bringing to mind lots of things because I'm getting towards the end as well. This was, according to Jung, what was at the root of the rupture between him and Freud. They went to America together to present psychoanalysis to the New World together. And on the road, because the um, time of travel was quite long, they would recount their dreams to each other and analyze. Each would analyze the dreams of the other. So that was the good old time between Freud and Jung. And at a certain moment, um, there was some element in a dream, and Freud refused to give any information on that. He just said, "No, that's not up for grabs." And a second um, moment was when Freud was analyzing Jung's famous dream, where he goes down several levels in the house um, through the attic and finds a, a cave underneath with an ossuary with lots of bones from skeletons lying around. And Freud insisted, but whose bones are they? And insisted that it was just one person. So in both cases, Jung rejected the authoritarian move of Freud, especially the first one, because Freud supposedly answered when Jung pressed for more details. I won't answer there because it would be bad for my authority. And Jung says in that moment, he lost his authority for me. So these are empirical examples. Everybody tells the story of a rupture in a way that's most favorable to them. Yet, this question of the analyst's gesture of authority in in drawing lines of demarcation um, is a central one, and Zizek is bringing it to the fore here. If the Freudian thesis in civilization and its discontents has any signification, um, it's this. One cannot, in a society, distinguish a fundamental, a normal fundamental mechanism and a pathological distortion. This distortion is a key for understanding what is already pathological in the fundamental mechanism. That is the critical social aspect of psychoanalysis, which is today more necessary than ever. So that's the double reversal that Zizek talks about at the beginning of for they know not what they do, and in lots of other places as well. You take uh, pathological distortion in we're talking about in a society. You reverse it to find what the normal mechanism the that has been distorted could be, and then you do a second reversal to find that this so-called normal mechanism is already a distortion. Anyhow, that's it. It's how long? 2 hours and 4 minutes for just 11, 11 pages. If I want to get to the end of this book in a reasonable time, I'll have to do maybe a little less commentary. So I hope to continue if people show any interest. So it's a scoop. It's a book that has lots of interesting things. It hasn't been translated into English up till now. So you're getting new information as proposed by Zizek, and you're getting it first. So see you next time.